So the first, I think there's a couple questions for Chrissy. We have one from Jess Atkinson asking about if you disaggregated the data by any other factors besides gender, for example, disability or socioeconomic status. There was also a question about how countries were chosen for VAX analysis to be implemented. So I'll open that up to Chrissy first.
Great. Yeah, those are two excellent questions. So in terms of disaggregation, the only other factor by which we disaggregated the data for these secondary analyses was just separating out respondents to the survey who had ever attended school and excluding those non-respondents. And so, no, we weren't able to look at socioeconomic status and to disaggregate by that. I think likely as a result of the sample size. But for the second round of analysis that we're currently undertaking, and this will be a deep dive in Cote d'Ivoire and likely Kenya and Nigeria. And Cote d'Ivoire and Kenya are both very, very recent surveys, which is exciting. But we hope to triangulate some of the existing findings with other data sets, which may include more information around, socioeconomic status, ethnographic data, and even potentially looking at actual education investments and how that correlates to rates of violence actually at the subnational level. But yeah, it's a great question. And then in the VAX are, how VAX countries are selected, just to share briefly, the sort of origin story of the VAX is really work that was done in Eswatini over a decade ago by CDC and UNICEF to really to create a survey mechanism to understand the relationship between gender-based violence as a driver transmission among adolescent girls and their disproportionately high HIV infection. And so as a result, the vast majority of the VACs in sub-Saharan Africa, where most of the VACs have been conducted, are funded through PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. However, some of the VACs, for instance, the ones that have been conducted in the Northern Triangle, are supported by USAID in collaboration with the International Organization for Migration. And just to say, in all the sub-Saharan VACs, there's a separate module on HIV, both in terms of status and risk, et cetera. And then in the Northern Triangle, for instance, there were specific modules developed around community violence and migration to understand the interplay of those dynamics with VACs. So certainly we'd like to do them in lots of places, but the funding is a driver, and we continue to explore different partners to implement VACs in different countries.
Great, thanks, Chrissy. Now I think for Stephanie and Meredith, there's a question about if there were any findings related to violence against girls on the way to school. Like, for example, what percentage of girls, boys experience violence on the way to the school? So I don't know if you could speak maybe to how that's represented on the eager resource, but also maybe in your new systematic review.
Sure. I think Chrissy might be better able to answer that from the VAX data, but in terms of how you can look at this in eager, a couple of things. As I mentioned, we're using the SDG indicators right now to overlay with the map view so that you can look, for example, at the countries where the highest proportion of students report that they've experienced bullying in school, and then the countries where there are SRGBV programs designed to address SRGBV. But really there are data limitations, and I'm wondering if we can somehow integrate the VAX data because it seems very valuable. So right now we don't have a separate indicator in there about violence experienced on the way to school, but would love Chrissy's thoughts on the best way to integrate that. In terms of our systematic review, we searched for and included any evaluations of interventions designed to address school-related gender-based violence, and that includes interventions designed to address violence on the way to school as well as in school. I would say that generally speaking, it's the same interventions that try to tackle these different barriers. So individual studies might have estimates of what's happening in terms of violence on the way to school versus in school. But as I said, none of the evaluations that we found estimated the impacts on education outcomes. So that's not to say that there are no effects, it's just to say that we don't have data on it. So that might be not too satisfying for the asker of that question. I don't know, Chrissy, if you have anything to add on that topic.
Yeah, this is such a good question. Unfortunately, you know, the VACs do ask lots of questions about the location of violence, but not specifically whether it's on the way to school. The question is really posed whether it happens on a road or a path. But it's, yeah, we're just not able to disaggregate it to understand if there's a relationship between the road and the school, for instance. But yeah, that's certainly a critical question for further research.
Great. I'll just go back to Stephanie. There's a question about when the systematic review and 2020 Gender and Education Roadmap you mentioned would be available.
Yeah, great question. So for the systematic review, the protocol was submitted to the Campbell collaboration and approved before we started the review, and then the report will be submitted to them in the coming weeks for peer review and approval, and then publication online. So we're hoping that that will happen by the end of the summer, but we are, the summer in the US, so August, but we are sharing preliminary findings through the eager website right now, and you can see that if you can either look at the study profile of our systematic review protocol, which is published online, or you can search by certain types of approaches that are included in our review, and our preliminary findings will show up. So we're trying to be as transparent about those results as we go through the peer review process. And then hopefully it will be published in different journals. But once the report is published online, it's publicly available. And the roadmap, as everyone can imagine, the plans are evolving in response to the current COVID-19 situation, but our plan was to share it and disseminate it in October. So I think we probably will have the same timing, and perhaps it will be more virtual dissemination than in-person dissemination. And then it will really be a kind of living document that we hope to update every couple of years or so.
Great. We do have about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to take one more question, but I might also ask the panelists if they wouldn't mind sharing their email address in case there's any other follow-up questions or something more specific that folks want to touch base on. So this last question I'll give to Shirley. There's a request to elaborate a bit more on the 1 to 5 years to address SRGBV. For example, might this be a SRGBV turnaround window?
Thank you for the question, and thank you, Margaret. In particular, Margaret worked with us on the foundations of this project, and I'm sure is excited to see how it's moving along. The 1 to 5 years grows out of the report, the guidance note, and I'm not sure if that grows out of particular studies that have been done already, although we know that the existing data is slim and that this is a new approach being tried. So it may well have to do with knowledge from the north that we know about schools changing and improving students' academic performance in 1 to 5 years. It could be from other resources as well. I think it's not yet, since this is just a pilot, we're just beginning to think about how long will it take to do these different things. And I think we'll be coming up with a list of factors, such as it will depend on what structures are in place to support this kind of work, what laws are in place, what's the willingness, the political will to support this, not only with laws, but actions and implementation, the kinds of materials that are available. For example, in our rural Shamba district, teachers were not familiar with the word gender. So if there's that lack of awareness and starting at that point, then how does one move along from there in order to build this understanding? Actually, one can move quite quickly, but we don't yet have information on how long that takes. So we'll be following it closely, following FAWESI as they continue, and look forward to hearing about more pilots that are going on about this as well.